All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Agentic Engineering, where we are trying to learn more and understand more about this sort of emerging world of AI and software development. I'm joined by Steve Klabnik today. Thanks so much, Steve, for taking the time. So, today we want to talk about basically the topic would be how to have useful conversations about AI when our goal is learning and our goal is understanding. This can be a tricky topic because sometimes conversations around AI end up with people talking past each other, maybe because they don't understand what the other person's talking about. Like one person has one idea of what aspect of AI or what kind of AI they're talking about, and the other person has a different idea. Or just because one person is trying really hard to convince the other person of a perspective that the other person's just not interested in. The goal of this whole series has been learning and understanding and just sort of trying to explore this space together. And so, what we want to talk about today is how can we have more useful conversations around AI when that's our goal? Our goal is understanding. It's not to convince people of something, but rather we just want to understand other people's perspectives. We want to understand what other people have learned about this topic. How can we do that effectively? So, Steve, you wrote a blog post a while back about sort of lamenting how frequently and in how many different ways these conversations can turn into things where it's just a shouting match, or it's just no one's making any headway or learning or understanding each other better. But fortunately, I think there is some hope. I think there are ways that we can like learn ways to just get our collective understanding of AI to improve, even despite these pitfalls. So yeah, Steve, why don't we just start off with a quick recap of what led you to write that blog post in the first place?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's always good to chat. So yeah, like the thing that made me write this post originally was that basically almost what you said. Nice choice of topic. Like I would have called myself an AI hater up until 2025 personally. And like at one point I decided, you know what, I'm going to learn a little more about this because I'm not really interested in it and I don't really like it very much, but that's not really an informed opinion. And I try to have informed opinions. And so occasionally I'll learn more about something I don't really like very much. And what I found is that it was difficult to like learn effectively about AI stuff because there was so much additional sort of like discourse piled onto all of it. I think that because this topic is so broad, it's very, very easy to sort of go in every direction simultaneously. And so that kind of like makes it hard to get a grip on things. And especially as I kind of like, got into like if a tool is probabilistic, then you need to like figure out how to deal with that. So like I have a long history of playing games. Like I played Magic the Gathering as a kid and I've been a video gamer for a while. And like a lot of things that you need to do in something like poker is like embrace the fact that it's random, but come up with strategies in order to mitigate that randomness so you can get the outcome that you want. And this is true in other forms of engineering as well, right? Like the laws of physics are deterministic as far as we know most of the time, but like, unknown things happen and et cetera. And you have to kind of like embrace randomness in the real world to some degree. And so like you need engineering strategies to deal with that. And so I was trying to figure out like, okay, if AI is randomly producing words, like how am I as an engineer supposed to use this as a tool to like build things effectively? And so I wanted to learn more about that. And what I found was that it was just really, really difficult to even like talk about this sort of narrow aspect. I was like, okay, I just really want to like learn about this slice of this topic. And everything became really like complex and then also very heated. The other thing that I think is sort of a little unique about this situation or this topic is like, back in my day, we used to argue about Rails versus PHP or Rails versus Node or whatever. And like technologists have always argued about technologies and thought some are good and some are bad. But like, I was never called a fascist for thinking that Ruby on Rails was good. You know what I mean? Like there was like there's sort of some amount of like acknowledging that like, okay, if technology may not be for me, so therefore I'm just like either, maybe people will talk some trash, but they're not like persistently on it and not the same like level of vitriol all the time that the AI topic has seemed to bring up. And then also I think it's sort of because of the scope issue. Like if you weren't doing web development, then the question of Rails versus PHP versus Node was totally irrelevant to you, and therefore you had no reason to get involved. But since AI is such a broad thing that kind of touches almost everything, it also means that almost anyone can and frankly should like have some sort of opinion on it because it's going to be affecting them in some way, good or bad. And so like that also encourages like bike shedding, but like in a literal sort of sense, I guess, of like, it is actually not just people talking about, like it's the color of the shed is not actually irrelevant. Like I think this is an important topic that people need to have discussions on, and sort of we collectively need to have discussions on, because like also, if we as a profession want to like control how we impact the world, then we're going to need to decide collectively what we're going to be doing, pro or con or nothing or something. And doing nothing is also doing something, I guess. And so like having discussions is sort of like step one to like figuring out what we want to be doing with this technology and what impact we think it should have on the world or not, and like all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I don't know, I guess that's like sort of the background, was like then me being super just frustrated with the fact that I couldn't seem to have a conversation without being derailed in every direction, and I couldn't find any useful information because there was so much noise going on, and that was just a little frustrating. So that's kind of what led to the post being written.
Yeah, I mean it's hard when you're trying to learn and other people have different goals in the conversation. They're not necessarily interested in facilitating your learning. They have their own, things that their goals are. Um, I think you mentioned either in the blog post or in another conversation, the failure mode of I'm in here in this conversation just trying to learn about this thing, and someone says, I don't want to talk about what you want to talk about. I want to talk about what I want to talk about. And you say, okay, that's fine, but I want to talk about something else. In this particular conversation, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with the point you're making, just rather that I want to stay focused on this one thing. And then someone says, well, that's just like a fill in the blank, and I'm saying fill in the blank because there are so many different ways that someone could go about that and say, like, you're wrong to, even care about that as opposed to the thing that I care about. And this goes from all different perspectives. Like sometimes you hear people say, like, I only want to talk about the ethics of AI, and if you want to talk about anything AI, that's unethical, and I want to convince you that it's important to only talk about that. And then on the flip side, you have the sort of like, well, why are you even bothering to talk about this current state of things? Obviously, AGI is right around the corner, and so everything you're talking about right now is pointless, and I don't want to talk with you about that. I just want to talk about the future in however long that happens to be, and how everything's going to be amazing then. And those are just two examples of ways that these conversations can go off the rails. But yeah, when you're just here saying, I just want to learn about how things are now and the current state of things, it's frustrating. So you mentioned in the blog post that this was a source of frustration for you, but it seems like you have developed some strategies based on having run into this a number of times. So why don't we just talk about, like, what is some advice that you would give to someone who's in that same position that you were in, where they're like,
Yeah.
I'm trying to learn, but I'm getting stuck because these conversations keep getting derailed.
I think that the core thing, and this is like kind of a little general, but I sort of start off this way because I also don't want this to be a like purely on the sort of like pro AI side either, is that I think that a lot of people who are anti AI sort of do themselves a disservice because of this as well, which is like just slightly reiterating what we previously said, which is like understanding what the other person that you're talking to is actually like interested in and open to, right? Like, so there's jokes, in the comments about like, Go versus Rust in terms of the battles about programming language stuff, right? And so like when I really like, I think the Go team is great, and I think Go is great, whatever, it's fine. It's not for me personally as a programming language, but I prefer Rust. And like, it's important when having those kinds of conversations that like, if somebody is like not interested in hearing about your Lord and Savior Ferris, that like that's not a good time to have that conversation because like they're not particularly open to it. And so I think that like a lot of sort of the highest level like pro versus con stuff is like sometimes people aren't even interested in switching their opinion from one side of that to the other, and sort of like recognizing that you're not going to budge someone on that plate, that thing, and then not wasting your own time trying to change their mind is like a sort of a pot, like knowing when to step out of the conversation, I guess is what I mean. Like if you can recognize that like, okay, this is not going to be productive because we have different goals, just like straight up, then like continuing it is a problem. Like you can't convince somebody to program in Rust if they don't want to by continuing to tell them how great Rust is, because they don't want to in that particular moment. And so like, you're not going to be able to convince somebody that AI is the worst thing ever if they're like, I'm not interested in hearing about the downsides, I'm interested in learning about the technology right now. Like you're just not going to get through to them. And so sometimes it's better to like step away from that conversation and like talk to someone else. And I think it's kind of a little generic, but I think it's sort of an important like kind of place to start because of the fact that this is such a fractal conversation, and there's so many different ways that you can talk about this problem, that like I think that's like step number one, is like recognizing, I like to visualize things as trees a lot, think it's due to being a programmer, but also like playing video games and stuff like that. Like I tend to think of things in sort of like trees, and it's like, okay, if somebody's in this branch of a conversation over here and you're in this branch of a conversation over there, then like advocating for whatever position it is that you're trying to advocate for, or also like on the flip side, learning something. Like you're not going to be able to learn something from someone who is interested in talking about a totally different topic. And so just sort of like recognizing like, okay, this is not the person I need to be talking to about this thing right now is kind of like step zero of having these conversations, I guess, is like trying to get into the right ones for whatever it is that your goal is in the first place.
So maybe to boil that all the way down to just like a real quick soundbite level of advice, it might sounds like what you're saying is sort of step one. If you find yourself in a conversation where you're feeling that this disconnect, step one is just state what your goal is. You say, "Hey, I'm just trying to learn about this. That's my goal for this conversation." And then if somebody responds and says, "Well, that's the wrong goal because I think you should have this other goal," then step two is maybe just say like, "Okay, but nevertheless, that's my goal, and so I'm not going to engage with you on that." Does anyone else want to talk to me about the thing that is my goal?
Yeah. And I think this kind of feeds into the second thing that really changed this for me, which is like having smaller conversations. And what I mean by that is like groups of people. Like I've
Mm.
had the worst of these conversations on what I would say is like mass social media platforms. Because anyone can read anybody's conversation and jump into the middle, and that's great for money things. Like I use Twitter for many, many years, and I love Blue Sky now. But like it also means that like you're sort of like talking in a public square where any random person with any random agenda can show up and decide to fight you about whatever it is that you're talking about. And so I found that I had significantly more productive conversations with people whenever it was sort of in smaller venues and down to even like in person as opposed to the internet. Like some of the most productive conversations I've had on this topic have been like at dinner with a couple of friends who have a variety of opinions, and then we're able to talk it all out rather than trying to like talk about it in sort of a mass media kind of thing. And so that also is related in the sense of limiting scope, but it's also sort of like limiting scope of who's in the conversation or who can like overhear what you're talking about, I guess, is like kind of the like a smaller venue. Yeah.
Right. It's like kind of the trade-off is on the one hand, by limiting yourself to a smaller scope of people, that means you don't have as big a pool of knowledge to draw on. You're going to get a smaller sample size, fewer quantity, a lower quantity of data points. But on the flip side, things are much less likely to get heated. I certainly have had my share of disagreements with, I think, every point in the AI pro and con spectrum. But I completely agree with you. In person, it's absolutely the least likely to get heated or become unproductive. And also, even just like in DMs or just in like small group chat or something like that. Yeah, it seems like the temperature is a lot lower than when you're everybody's shouting across the public square at one another.
Yeah. And it can even like be true even in smaller groups sometimes. So like I have a Discord with friends and friends of friends that's like about 100 people, and not all 100 people are active, but there's a very like strong pro and anti faction in there, and people were fighting about it in our like programming channel all the time. And so we said like, okay, let's make a separate channel for AI related discussions. So that way the people that don't want to hear about people arguing about this can like not argue about this. But eventually we ended up just like splitting it into an entirely separate Discord with just the people that wanted to have these like talking about the tactics of using AI and learning about that stuff, because having it even in the same space of the small group chat with other people who were upset about the topic, like they, also didn't want to like, they were like, it's too tempting to click over to that channel and read it whenever I'm feeling angry, and then I get fighting, and now we're fighting and we're friends and we're not supposed to be arguing about stuff. And so I don't want to do that. And so sometimes it is just literally creating separate spaces, even with similar groups of people, because that's just like where you're going to be, doing well by the other people that you're talking to for whatever sort of reason that is.
Right, and that's with 100 friends. Imagine if you multiply that by a couple orders of magnitude, and almost all of them are strangers.
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's a useful suggestion as well, I would say, is that if you have a private space and you're having a problem with some people wanting to talk about AI and other people not wanting to talk about it at all, maybe you just should split it off into a separate space just so that you can maintain the space, people can be happy and get along. And then, the other people who want to talk about a different topic can do so elsewhere. Um, I've also seen a dynamic that can happen within friend groups is that some people move from one side to the other. One of our earlier episodes in the series was actually talking with someone who had gone from being a really enthusiastic AI user to saying, you know what, I actually want to dial it back like a lot, and maybe like use my brain more and use the AI less. And we've also seen the reverse, like as you mentioned at the beginning, you starting off saying like I don't want to use this at all, and then sort of switching sides. That can happen in friend groups as well. And you might think, oh, well, if we can just categorize everyone into pro and anti AI, and then they can just, populate these spaces, maybe it's fine. But people change their minds, and they have different experiences, and also the technology changes, and what people think about the technology changes. So yeah, it
I
seems
think
like a yeah.
for any topic where it gets heated, everyone assumes that you have to pick one side or the other. But it turns out that most people are pretty apathetic, actually. Like a lot of people don't care about AI one way or the other. And it's just because the people who are loudest online, both for and against, are loud and therefore visible. And so, it turns out that there's often a group of people who just either have no opinion or just don't care and don't want to talk about a thing. Like one of the big rules of the internet that I always try to remember is that like out of every 100 people that read something, like one of them comments. Like that's always been the case with forums. There's far more readers than there are writers, and that doesn't mean you can like know what their opinions are in any direction. Like sometimes it's apathy and sometimes it's pro or con, but they just don't express them, but they're just actually reading stuff. And so that can be like a tricky part of like having conversation in public on social media as opposed to sort of like in small groups with people.
And there's a useful implication to that, because you can still learn things from people who are not vocal about their AI use one way or the other. I mean, definitely I've had conversations with people where it started off with me asking, what something benign like, what do you think of AI? And they'll say, oh, yeah, I don't use it that much, but, and then they'll tell me how they use it. And I'll say, it never occurred to me to use it that way. You're the first person I've heard say that they've used it in that way. So I was able to learn something from them. But if I hadn't actually asked them about it, that may have never happened. And I have to admit that because a lot of these conversations do get so heated, even knowing intellectually that it's a pretty small percentage of people who are causing the conversations to get heated, it still makes me sort of default reluctant to have conversations about AI in these public places. But to your point, that the same rules need not apply to smaller and smaller groups, especially if it's like one-on-one in person. The odds of that getting heated about AI are very, very low. And so if your goal is to learn something, I think it's worth just asking the person that you're talking to, what do you think about it? And maybe it'll turn out that you don't have any common ground, you don't have anything to learn from each other. But I think the stakes might be lower than you might guess just from looking at how some of these things blow up online.
Yeah, I was at a friend's house last night, and there was some people, a variety of people that were there. Just like a couple, it was a very small group, but one of them is a professor, and she's in sort of the humanities side of things, no, like not a hard sciences professorship. And somebody brought up like, oh yeah, like how's AI been changing your work? And I kind of like naturally steeled myself for like, okay, I don't know these people very well. I have no idea what this conversation is going to be like because of that sort of hesitancy around stuff. And then especially with knowing how, higher education has been like, there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions on how AI is affecting higher education right now. And, things like cheating and, homework and like all that stuff, it affects sort of everything. And she ended up like making some really interesting like points about how like she had been a professor in the 90s and underwent the like mailing paper. She's like, I was on a journal review panel like in the 90s and had to deal with sort of like mailing physical paper manuscripts around and then transitioning from that to email, and how that was like a really big transition in the way that she worked. And she's like, this kind of just reminds me of that, and that there's like some like tools that you just can't use anymore. Like if a student used to miss class, she's like, I would have them like write a small report on the case studies that we talked about in class or whatever, and now that's just useless. Like there's no point in asking a student to do that because you can't like do that anymore. And she's like, I've changed some stuff where, sometimes if I have people write an essay and they used AI, I like ask them to include their prompts in an appendix, because then that like leads to useful in-class discussions about like these sort of things and how that's changed stuff. And so she's like, I focused, what my work is to more in-class things and less take-home work, because you can't really like have ChatGPT in your ear while you're having a classroom discussion. At least right now, anyway. We'll see what those crazy kids cook up over wherever they're doing that kind of stuff. But like, And so she was much more like measured and chill about it. And even the stuff that was downsides, it was like there was a reasonable conversation about the downsides instead of it being like I'm so used to the online discussion being so instantly heated that this in-person conversation that was totally pleasant and frankly interesting, I like started off by being like, because that's like a thing.
Yeah. Speaking of AI at work, something that occurred to me recently is that if you ask anyone, hey, what's it like being at a company where they went from nobody's using AI at work at all to now some people are using AI at work, or maybe everyone is, and how has that transition gone? How have those conversations happened? What's the dynamic been like? Most people in the world have been at one or at most two jobs where that's been the case. So everybody has their own sample size of very, very small numbers because, 5 years ago, the answer was, of course, nobody's using this stuff. And today, the answer is usually there's some amount of it, depending on what kind of industry you're in and regulations and all that. But nobody really has a pretty big sample size personally. I think maybe the best you could have is if you're a consultant and you're jumping between lots of different companies over the past 2 years, let's say. But that's pretty rare and hard to find. So I guess I'm kind of curious what your experience has been, even acknowledging the sample size problem
Yeah, yeah.
of having these conversations, not with groups of friends or with strangers online, but specifically with coworkers.
Yeah, at my current job, Oxide, we are very like bottom up driven in all things, and so like we don't even mandate that the same teams use the same like dev tools. Like some teams work on GitHub and some teams work with Garrett, and like everything is totally like not mandated at all, basically. And so that has led to a very interesting situation with the use of AI things because like originally when I got interested in this topic and I started experimenting with using it, like basically the like I was realizing like, oh yeah, I'm gonna spend $100 this week if I keep doing this. So I should like talk to my boss about like, hey, am I allowed to like expense this as opposed to like doing this on my personal, dime because I'm like messing around, sort of on the job with these tools. And the answer was like, sure, feel free to like expense it. If if Claude costs $100 a month and that saves you 1 hour a week, or whatever, that's like super far ahead. So like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. And so that was like this very sort of like chill atmosphere from like management. But a significant number of my coworkers really, really hate AI as well. And so what helps here is that in my personal situation, like because it's not being forced on anybody, we did a similar sort of thing where there's a group chat that's like Oxide LLMs where people that want to talk about the topic get to talk about it, and the people who don't mostly just like don't, and occasionally will like complain about it in other channels or whatever, but it's not really like a big argument. And that works because we don't have a mandate for management, and so it doesn't really like force those things to sort of like become heated. I have like talked to friends who have worked in places like while I was undergoing this sort of like transition of like I don't use these tools, so like I enjoy using these tools. I have another friend who is like not particularly pro or anti AI, but he's on a dev tools team at a company, and they were like being forced by management to adopt these tools, and that caused a lot of heat and a lot of argument because when you start when you start putting like KPIs on like you must use this much AI this quarter or whatever, like naturally, I mean, the Vim and Emacs wars were always, big. And obviously, there's the new editors like Zed. But like, if we had forced everyone at the company to use Emacs, there would have been riots in like the old days, And so it's like not really a new thing that developers like using the tools they like to use, and being forced to use other tools by management is like a problem. But I think there's also kind of like one thing that can make this difficult. And I think sort of back up to the like slightly higher level, it's like recognizing why people feel a certain way can be useful because like sometimes even if it's like even as somebody who likes using AI tools, I can recognize that somebody who's being forced to use it at work when they don't like it, that sucks actually. And so I'm not like interested in trying to convince them that like, oh, you should like the tool though, because you have to use it anyway. It's more of like okay, yeah, like I'm definitely not going to like try to protolize to you about like why I think that this newest thing is like pretty neat, because like you're in a situation that's like making you very unhappy at work. And that's like, important to like not, nudge people who are already having a bad day. And like also acknowledging that there's a big difference. Ooh, can't say words this morning. There's a very big difference between like I use this tool and I enjoy it and I'm choosing to use it versus I use this tool and I don't like it, so I'm choosing not to use it, versus I am being forced to use this tool by my job and I don't like it. And that stuff, gets complicated. I think that's where like the coworker discussion can really be complicated, because depending on what your company's public stance is towards AI, like, that can cause a lot of issues. And I think even amongst some people who are more pro, like it is vaguely annoying that every single company that takes investment money needs to have some sort of AI angle right now. Like that is just genuinely annoying. And so, again, sort of back to that scope, like when you're trying to talk about learning stuff, like, okay, that's different than like the macro trends of like, yeah, it sucks that the only thing that gets invested in is AI. And so now my toothbrush has AI in it for some reason. And I don't know why it does, is like, those two things can both genuinely be true, that I like using Claude, and I like find driving down the 101 to be like ridiculous. Every single blackboard is black on white, and it's just like AI for your random noun. Like I was recently in San Francisco twice this past month. I don't live there, and I was just like, God, every single billboard. Like you think nothing else was happening in the entire world. So like, yeah.
Yeah, I have not been to San Francisco in a while, but I can picture it
Yeah.
right now. Yeah. Okay, so well, speaking of conversations with people, we did have a question from the chat, which was around basically, the way that they phrased it was like, what is your counter argument to someone who would bring up the energy usage of AI, or like the environmental considerations? But since the point of this conversation is to be mostly around like how do we have useful conversations here, I'm curious about, like, I mean, I'm certainly, you've
Yeah.
seen some of these conversations. Like, how do you think about having a conversation like that that doesn't devolve into a shouting match?
So talking about this, like I'm going to try to go specific and meta at the same time,
Cool.
because this one is like also super complicated. I guess like even when you try to choose one corner, like let's talk about energy usage, not even broad environmental impact, but like energy
Sure.
usage. There's like knowing, like having some amount of like informedness on the topic super helps, because like on this specific angle, for example, like I'm of the personal opinion that like telling people to use less energy has not generally worked, and so that like overall strategy does not work. So I'm like tend to be a little dismissive is incorrect. Like I care a lot about the environment, but like there's complicated things here. But like there is a specific data center in Memphis that is like violating environmental laws and therefore polluting stuff. And so like knowing that that's the case, like to sort of be like more meta about it, it's like being aware that like this particular issue is like a big one in this one particular town, and that is causing these sort of discussions, can help you navigate that. Because like, are we having a question about energy usage in general? Like, is the idea here to understand how much, when I ask Claude for help, is, what energy is that using, versus when I microwave my, toast or what, microwave toast. I'm trying to got breakfast food on the brain because I didn't eat breakfast yet this morning. But like when I put oatmeal, that's a good microwave breakfast food. When you put your oatmeal in the microwave, like how much energy does that use, versus me asking Claude? Like, and I don't actually know the answer to that question, but is it like, is the person trying to get at that? Or are they worried about the social implications? Like, because is this about like data centers, companies, promising jobs and getting tax cuts, and then people are, like want to talk about like the real estate implications of energy usage, like because you got to put them near where a data center needs to go. It needs to have a lot of power, and so like how does that work geographically? Are we talking about the like direct environmental impact of the pollution, or are we trying to talk about how it fits into broader climate change issues, like more generally, or are we trying to talk about solutions? Like another, this is a very general like having good conversations topic, but I was reading some relationship advice at one point, and it was like, sometimes people want to hear solutions, and sometimes people just want to be heard. And I think
Mm.
that's like, especially with the environmental side or some of the other sort of like more ethics angle topics around AI, there's kind of a like, are you interested in looking for a solution to this problem, or are you just like interested in talking about how bad it is? Because those are also two different conversations to have. And I think a lot of times with some of this stuff, like, it can be useful to be like, all right, are we trying to commiserate, or are we trying to solve it? Because like, because like there's a very big difference between like, it is really unfortunate that Memphis is being polluted and that really sucks, versus like, well, maybe we should be trying to build more into clean energy because that would like help in general. But like, if you're really just trying to like express frustration about why pollution is bad, starting to talk about like, well, let's invest in nuclear is like not, it's not actually addressing the real underlying concern, which is the real part of like having the conversation in a productive way versus the unproductive way, is like, like what is the actual underlying thing people are trying to get at, and then sort of having a conversation that is respectful of that, as opposed to trying to just like assume that you know what's going on with those kind of things, basically.
Got it. Okay, so again, I'm hearing two pieces of advice here. One is to avoid talking past each other, try to get more specific. So if someone brings up energy or environment, then maybe say, okay, what specific aspect of that are you thinking about? Because it could be that maybe you're both on exactly the same page, but it could also be that maybe you're both not even thinking about the same things in the first place. And then the second piece of advice is getting more specific about the goal. And in a relationship, I can see how that you
Yeah,
could be
yeah.
explicit
I'm
about that
always a like
framing.
fixer. I'm like, you're upset, let me fix it. It's like a lot of times, and but also in my own life, I'm often just I want to complain. I'm not trying to fix it right now. So it's like things are hard, but like, yeah, totally.
Yeah. I don't know how well necessarily if I'm thinking about like a public internet discussion, it's going to
Yeah,
work to be
yeah.
like, well, do you just want to vent right now? uh,
Yeah, but it
but
happens sometimes when you're having not with total strangers. Like I have had this happen with friends where, I have been close to some people who have very diametric, like things about me, and they will like maybe be like complaining about something. I'm like, you know what? I don't need to try to like talk to this person right now because they're just venting and that's fine. You know what I mean? And like, we're friends and it's cool and we disagree and it's just like not a big deal. And so, like not actively trying to pick fights is a good way to not get into fights on the internet, it turns out, but just like general de-escalation and like recognizing that they're not necessarily trying to turn up the heat either. They're just expressing themselves in a way that they need to in that particular moment. It's like, yeah, I don't know.
yeah. Okay, well, speaking about the problem of talking past each other, I mean, there's so many different aspects of this. Like you've said before that AI conversations can be fractal because you open one door and it turns out there's three more doors behind it, and there's so many different ways that you could get like down to increasing levels of specificity. Um, One of the ways that I've seen this turn into somewhat of a failure mode is getting back to the thing you said earlier about probabilities, where you have two different people who are talking about maybe even they've gotten as specific as saying I'm talking about the same use case, like AI for web development on a brand new project that's, from scratch, but they have two totally different experiences because of just all the different variables involved. Could be random chance, but it could also just be maybe they're not using the same models. Like this person's using, this model, maybe this person's using this other model. Maybe they're using the same family of model, but 2 years separated. And so they've just had very different experiences. All of this, I think, boils down to talking past each other due to small sample sizes and the number of variables that are involved, leading to just wildly different experiences. Have you had any success in figuring out how to address that problem and how to sort of make sure that you're talking about the same things before you get too far down the fractal of one particular set of doors?
Yeah, I definitely have really struggled with this for sure, because another thing that I've seen in a failure mode in this specifically is when you're like, okay, well, so for me, because I like basically before Claude 4 came out, I didn't like these tools and at all. And so for me, it seemed very obvious that like, oh, okay. Like when someone would say, well, I tried this 6 months ago and I hated it. And I'm like, well, I think that the new models really went from like not being useful to being useful for me. And so that's the thing. And their response was like, oh, well, everyone's been saying that for years. Every time they get better, that like, okay, well, now it's good enough. And so now you should get into it. And like, I'm sick of hearing about it. And so that was like,
Mm.
what was like insightful for me in terms of understanding the differences turned out to be like not as insightful to other people, and or like slightly annoying because they saw it as part of this like pattern of conversations that I wasn't even involved in. I was like, well, I didn't say that 6 months ago. I'm a different person than that. And so like it's just true for me that the tools are different now. And so that definitely can be sort of a failure. I think that like it's also this is one of the things that make this so difficult, is that like, I mean, this is not a new problem. I think is the ultimately it comes down to, like, take TDD for example, right? Like you could be like, I'm using TDD in a Rails app, with Cucumber, and I liked it, and then somebody else is like, it worked horribly at my job and it made it not work really well, right? Like we've had these kinds of situations before, but that never turned into like the same degree of like vitriol or explosion in all cases. And so I think that's like part of why I've like struggled to find a good solution, is that like I'm not sure we ever really found a great way to talk about tools productively, like on a broad scale, or at least in a way that like people identify with their tools a lot, and then they're sometimes they just like want to love a tool for whatever reason it is. I also think that like due to there being so many differences, like it's also like the struggle here is like, while trying to get down to the specifics, like you'll also end up with a small sample size, because the number of people that are using Claude Code 2.0 in the console versus the new extension in VS Code on a Rust web app that's over 10,000 lines of code, right? Like everything that you add on to making it more and more specific, like also means you can't share as much information. And so I think just like having some sort of understanding that there's no like one answer, like this is really probable itself, right? Like it's not as if we like two people use the exact same thing that they're inherently going to like converge on an answer. It's about trying to figure out what the like sample size is of things overall. And so I think that's like I have found that like a lot of people I've always liked programming. I've been doing programming for like 30 years, 30 plus years at this point. But like also a lot of my work in the last decade has been like reviewing code and like thinking about architecture. And I really like that work. And other people like are really, really interested in the like fiddly bits of like, you know, turning the object around and then pressing the right button. And then it finally like clicks into place and it works right. And so I found like, oh yeah, like I have a tendency to like these tools because like the like getting my fingers into the details is like not as interesting to me as it was before. And so therefore like even if I do like that work, it's like the stuff that I like about our discipline has changed a little over time. And therefore like I'm going to have, even if we are using the same models in the same way and the same stuff, like we just have different preferences about like how we like to do our work and what's important to us in our work. And you know, so that's like some of it too is kind of like acknowledging just in general that like your next the consensus is not even necessarily the goal, it's understanding, because like this is not really about like solving the question of is AI good or bad or not. It's about like coming to an understanding with enough people that you're able to like figure out the distribution of how you and others are thinking about this and how that can like affect your ability to learn things. Because like once you learn like, okay, this friend of mine really also works in a similar way to me and has a good time with the tools. If I want to ask a question about like prompting agents effectively, I'll then go ask that person, right? So I guess I'd say it's not even necessarily about like having that conversation be more productive. It's like a meta game of like figuring out who to have what conversations with, because once you've identified who is interested in what topic, you can have, you know, better conversations with them about whatever thing it is that you're trying to learn. And then also not in the other way trip over the landmines of like if you're a big anti, you know, AI person and you're trying to figure out how to like, you know, talk about the energy issue in a way that will convince people that are not, you know, pro energy, knowing that your one friend is like unreachable on this topic is like it's not worth bringing up with them is also useful too, because you know you don't want to like it's not productive for what you're trying to accomplish either. So yeah, I think that's maybe not exactly an answer, but it's like the closest thing I've got to like being related to that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I think I can distill a couple of pieces of advice out of that. But first, I have to note that I got a funny mental image when you were talking about like the TDD analogy. It's like imagine you're driving down 101 and there's just billboards TDD in your face all the time, right? There's
Yeah.
advocacy for TDD. I can see if I'm like, but TDD isn't working for me. I would be really frustrated by just how, you know, constantly I'm being bombarded with these messages of how great TDD is when I'm like, I'm just having a bad experience with it, hypothetically. Um, but yeah, I think in terms of concrete advice to distill down from that, one seems to be if someone is making a generalization and not talking about specific details of how they got there, it might be good just to ask. So if someone says something like, AI is good for blank, but not blank, period. And that's you know the statement they make. You might say like, okay, well, when you say that, like which specific model, which specific tool, like when was this, what were you working on, you know, what was the stack, things like that, could really help you realize like either, oh, this is very directly applicable to what I do. The only difference is blah, and maybe that's not a relevant difference. Or you might say, oh, this person is just using it for a completely different purpose, and also they were doing it at a completely different time. And that's really important context to help you understand, like even if you assume that their experience was accurate for them at that time, you know, those variables, like knowing what the variables actually are, can help you assess that better. And then another piece of advice, I'm distilling out for what you're saying,
Yeah.
is let's suppose that I've gotten all the variables nailed down, but I'm still having a different experience than this person. It could be that it is just like how I'm approaching it. Like you mentioned, you know, some people are like unreachable on this topic, or like, you know, when you started off, you were kind of coming in from like, I'm going to try this tool, but I'm going in planning to not like it. And you were surprised that you ended up liking it more than you thought you would. Um, but of course, plenty of people are coming in sort of almost trying to not like it, or saying like, I have pre-decided that I don't like this. Now let me go make this thing fall on its face. Whereas other people are kind of coming at it from the opposite perspective of saying like, I really want to try to get value out of this thing. Let me think really hard about like what my prompt is and what my context. Maybe if it doesn't work the first time, I'll try again and see if I can like massage my words and what files I'm showing it and things like that. The scope of the problem to try and get a better outcome. And of course, it should come as no surprise that even with all of those variables being the same, the second person's gonna have some sort of better experience in some dimension if they're trying really hard to have one. Um, but again, you don't get that from AI is good at blank, but not blank. Period.
Yeah. Or just like AI is going to take everyone's jobs, or AI is going to make the economy irrelevant because robots will do all the work, or like any of those kinds of like very broad sweeping statements are just like really hard to, falsify. And so if that's kind of the conversation you're having, it's like not good or useful, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this also does get into the pithy dismissal of what we were just talking about is someone just says, oh, it's a skill issue. The reason
Yeah.
that I'm having a good experience and you're not having a good experience is that I have more skills than you do, which of course is not helpful. But also, as somebody who's coming by and, if I'm new to this space and I'm reading these comments that people are having or these discussions, the back and forths, and someone says, "Oh, well, it's because it's a skill issue," and the other person responds like, "No, it's not a skill issue. Here's why it's not a skill issue," and there's another generalization. That's hard for me to parse. I'm looking at this and I'm saying like, is it a skill issue? Or I mean, it's probably to some extent, but how much is it? Am
Yeah.
I going to have a bad experience because I have no skills because I'm new to this? How do
This
you think
specific
about?
one is really
Yeah.
hard. Yeah, because like, yeah, sorry, you're about to ask
No,
me
no,
to
no. That's
interject with it,
that's
but like this
go for it.
particular,
I was
the
just about to
skill issue
ask. What?
thing is very hard because like it's I've been trying, when I talk to people about this recently, to make an analogy to Vim, actually, because like, and just the key bindings, like not even like Vim itself, right, but like the strategy of modal editing, but that just gets shortened to Vim and everyone's like lingo, because like it's a running gag how difficult Vim is to learn, right? Like you can't figure out how to quit Vim, and that's how you get addicted to it. Has been a joke for longer than I've been alive, probably. Maybe not
Yeah.
that. I don't think Vim is actually that old, but like, because I'm pretty old. But like, so there you have to like. There's a really fine line between like acknowledging that tools sometimes require skill, and that not every good tool is easy to use. Like that is true, but like also it can be very condescending to say that like the reason that you're not good at this tool is because you suck at it, right? And so like walking that line is like very, very, very hard. And so I don't necessarily know, outside of the other strategies of like having these conversations in smaller groups where I'm able to like say all this preamble basically about like, I am not trying to like denigrate your skill, but it is also true there's a learning curve, right? Like we're willing to acknowledge there's learning curves in almost everything, but then like it's easy to twist it into an insult in this particular case because the temperatures are so high and people are so predisposed to like sort of reading what you say in the worst light as opposed to the best light, that like it can come across very easily as like you're saying that I suck and therefore get mad, which if you were would be a good reason to get mad at someone. Like just also to be clear, you know what I mean? Like so like that's I think the like sort of kind of biggest issue. And then also like a thing that inherently makes the skill thing a little different than some of the other questions is because there is so much change in this space and it's happening so quickly, what skills are relevant and what skills you need to get good at are totally different. And so like that can be very difficult because like again, I hated spicy autocomplete and I love agentic style coding, and that's only been a thing for, it's coming up on a year soon. Like that's like a
Yeah.
less than a year old thing. And so developing what skills like you need to interact that, it's only been possible for a little while, and that's if you immediately jumped on it as opposed to not. So there isn't like there are in an area of technology that moves so quickly, it becomes really difficult to like for some people there is a very reasonable thing which is like, I'm just going to wait and see how this all shakes out, and then like I will learn about it then. And I think that's like totally fine position. And in fact, I think it's sort of the default position of most things, right? Is like you only have time to learn so many things, and so like if you don't want to learn about this stuff, that's like cool because there's so many other things that I'm not learning about because I am learning about AI tools. But then like you get into like even just like everyone was talking about prompt engineering a year ago, but like now it's about context engineering, and like prompt engineering is not seen as being very important. And like that may be a sentence that many people in the audience have never even heard if you're not like super up on the AI details. And so this is another area, I guess, to sort of bring it back to the skill issue thing. So it's like extra easy to come across as insulting because it's like, oh yeah, you haven't learned about this thing that's been relevant for 6 months and people have only really developed any sort of intuition for it in the last 3 months. Your skills are so outdated, bro, comes across as very condescending. And so this, I guess I'm just saying, is like this area is a particularly tricky one to talk about because of the fact that like you have to be acknowledging the human side of like skills are not easy to develop or free to develop in a time or money sense. And so just like that again with the conversation kind of ballooning out, like it could be difficult to acknowledge. And so when you're trying to acquire those skills, it becomes difficult because you're like, I want to learn, if I do want to learn about these things and like why does this matter and why does this not matter and how is this changing, then that can become really difficult because you're trying to like talk about learning these skills, and then that can come across to like people who aren't into it as like you're bad at these skills, and you're like, I'm not saying that, I'm saying I'm bad at this and I want to learn about it. It's like, so anyway, there's like something in there, but I think the skill question and like the difficulty or ease of use is just like a vast topic that's also really really difficult to like have a good conversation about for sure.
Gotcha. Wow, we've been talking for a while. Why don't we just wrap up with just sort of ending the story that you began with? So you started off with like, I'm trying to get into AI and I'm finding it really difficult to learn about this topic because there are all these conversations that are just, going nowhere, talking past each other, getting heated and so forth. What ended up working for you? Because obviously you did end up successfully learning about it. Just how did you get from no knowledge and wanting to learn to actually having successfully learned something? What did that path look like for you?
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to how I've built all the skills I've ever built, which is like being willing to be bad at something and not getting on tilt about it to like lean too much into the gamer technology again or like terminology again. But it's like basically like to get better at anything, you have to try stuff and then see what works and see what doesn't, and then like iterate from there. And so like if something is like not working and it's frustrating, it's really easy to get upset, but then that means you make worse decisions about the thing. And so I kind of just like gave it a shot, tried to figure out what worked what worked and what didn't work. I didn't try to change too much all at once. So it was like, okay, I'm like not going to write out a massive Claude.md. I'm just going to like, write a 3-line thing and then just start talking to it and see kind of what happens. And then sometimes I'd do experiments. So I would like set up different branches for different things. And I would say like, okay, here's a long detailed prompt in this one. Here's a short, basically no prompt in this one. Here's another strategy where I'm going to ask it to do TDD explicitly in this one versus not. And just kind of like mess around with sort of what kind of like worked for me, because I do think that there is an element of these tools that it's like difficult to teach because I think it comes across as like really personal. Like your conversation skills are difficult to build in general, and now you're having a conversation with a computer that's like not even human. And so it's just like a totally different kind of like thing. And so I think that like trying to come in with the intention of like I am here to learn and it may work out or it may not, and I'm going to try to take care and like realizing like, okay, this worked really well for me, this doesn't work really well for me, matters, because like also that's just required to keep up with the thing too. Like Claude 4.5 comes out and it's very different than 4.0 was, and so you're kind of like partially relearning how to work with the thing, because that's just like the way that it is. Not to overly anthropomorphize, but like if you get a new member on your team at work, you got to like refigure out what the situation is with working with them, right? And so because this world is evolving so quickly, you kind of have to be in the mindset of like, I am trying stuff out. I see what works and I see what doesn't. And, I continue doing the things that work for me and I stop doing the things that don't, and be willing to like reevaluate and be open to new things is like basically just required due to the change of pace alone. It's like not even about it being AI. It's like any fast moving area of technology. That's kind of like the area that's the way you have to approach skill acquisition in those contexts. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Steve, thank you so much for talking to me about all this. I think we got a lot of like really concrete, useful pieces of advice for how to navigate this space better and to just be able to learn even in an environment that's not necessarily the most innately conducive for learning.
Yeah,
So
it's
thanks so much
hard.
for taking the time, and thanks to everybody else for joining in.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
All right, take care.